Welcome everyone to another localized event. My name is Michelle. I'm the Events and Community Manager at Localize. And if this is your first time with us or new to the community, we are a global platform where we connect students and recent graduates to job opportunities and career resources. So part of those career resources are our amazing pool of experts who are here to guide you in your career paths, in your decision to choose which career you want to follow, or if you're transitioning, this is the place to ask any questions about the expert's journey or any questions you might have in your own journey. So as you might know, today we're going to be talking about careers in finance, which is a broad topic, but we're going to be discussing some skills and roles in fintech, in venture capital, banking, and more, and all of the options that you can have after graduation for a career in finance. So we are going to be talking about it with our amazing expert, Safa Saeed. So I'm going to do a quick introduction about you. Safa Saeed is the Vice President of Acquisition and Strategic Investments at JPMorgan Chase, currently in New York City, focusing on venture capital and growth stage equity investments, especially in topics as enterprise technology, markets infrastructure, and wealth funds. So if you're not familiar with these topics, we're gonna be discussing them. So actually, Sarah is a former Fulbright scholar. We were discussing before hitting the record button, and you will hear about it in her journey. She's not originally from the US, she's from Iraq. So she went to the US in a Fulbright scholarships, and we're gonna be talking about it. But she has a decade of experience working with startups, engineering, and financial service companies, both in the US and the MENA region. So I'm gonna stop it there because we want to hear it from you. And before actually starting the conversation, again, if any of you have any questions are welcome. You can send them in the chat, or you can also send them in the Q&A function, which you should be able to find in the bottom part of your Zoom in the bar. You will find it there. So send any questions at any time, and we will address them either during the conversation or at the end of the conversation. So, yeah, I would like to start the conversation asking you, Safa, if you can briefly share your background, your journey, and how did you end up in your current position at JPMorgan?
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the questions and the introduction. And Ramadan Kareem for those that are fasting and observing the month. So let's see. I don't know. I feel like I've had quite a strange journey overall, but it started when I studied engineering, telecom engineering back in Iraq. And right out of school, my first job was technical support at a small internet service provider in Baghdad. And then from there, I moved to Ericsson. As I moved there, I, gained a lot of Cisco certificates. So I was a Cisco certified associate and professional in network routing and switching. And then after a couple of years at Ericsson, I pivoted to working with startups. So I was the business development manager for Careem, and I'm pretty sure people from the Middle East would know it, and people not from the Middle East. It's essentially a ride-hailing company similar to Uber. And then from there, I moved to the US to study my MBA here in Michigan, Western Michigan University. And during my 2 years of study, I did a bunch of sort of like consulting with startups. I did an internship. I did, a couple of positions on campus teaching students some technical course. And then close to graduation, I started to apply to roles in finance. And that's how I ended up in JPMorgan.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I know this was like super summarized for all of your journey, but I'm curious, like you already mentioned, you studied something that was not related or that we wouldn't think it related to finance in your bachelor. Then you decided to do another master's program through the Fulbright scholarship. But you mentioned you studied telecommunication engineering.
Mhm.
And you had like some roles for a few times related to that, including like your job in Ericsson. So how do you think, or how do you see it now that years have passed, related or not related to what you're doing right now? How do you see that background impacted what you're doing right now, or how did it like maybe led you to take this path?
I think essentially there are two types of people that end up in finance. There is the cookie cutter route, which is typically your person who studies finance and is certified and all of that, which makes it simpler and easier and straightforward. And then there are the people from non-target schools and sort of random backgrounds, which you very rarely see. But personally, I think earlier in my life, as I was working as an engineer, I gained a lot of technical skills, a lot of troubleshooting and problem solving, um, getting to the bottom of things, and working with a high level of complexity and details. And that is something that you can transfer to essentially any place. And it is quite useful, especially at a large corporate. JPMorgan is one of the largest banks in the world. They have over 250,000 employees globally. And so when you are working in any part of the bank, you're working at a very large scale. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with in the beginning, and I myself struggled with it. But I think that one of the things that helped was the fact that I was used to working with a high level of complexity and so many details and tight deadlines, and some skills came up and transferred from my career as an engineer, but some of the others also were helped by the fact that I worked with startups, which are usually chaotic and unpredictable and have a very fast timeline. And so somehow every step of the way, there are skills that eventually would be useful in any company at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I would like to ask, like, apart from those skills that you already mentioned, which are other skills that you find it really, really important to have for a career in finance? And if that's super broad, we can go into the details of like the areas that we have in the topic, like fintech, venture capital, banking, and others.
Mhm. Um, I think that, generally it depends on the kind of role that you have and whether it is a purely finance role or not. But since we're hoping that folks here are interested in the career in finance specifically, a lot of times it helps if you are detail oriented and you're able to sift through pages and pages of research. If you're able to comfortably work with numbers, if you have that, that is sort of like essential in any role that you have. The other piece of it is if you work in a front office in finance, and front office professionals are essentially people that work with clients. And so in that part of the bank, think about it as a sales position or as business development. You're working with clients, meaning you have to be able to handle a lot of personalities and a wide range of emotions and an unpredictable ask from a client at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that flexibility to work with people, work with different backgrounds, and also sometimes to be persuasive and knowing how to manage different stakeholders, because when you're working at a front office, you're not only just managing your relationship with the client, but also you're managing your relationship internally with folks at the bank itself that might have competing agendas with your client's priority. So it depends on the kind of role that you're looking for. And we can touch on this a little bit. especially at large companies, whether it's JPMorgan or any other big bank, think about it as any other company, meaning you would have your typical functions as HR, operations, legal, marketing. You would have a lot engineering, by the way. Engineering is one of the biggest departments that we have, and not just your typical software engineers, but also a lot of other adjacent roles that are, for example, your analyst or your research professional. And those don't necessarily require a 100% finance focus. For example, if you work at a front office as an underwriter, you would need to be certified and you need to gain a lot of your banking certifications in order to be eligible to work with different clients in different jurisdictions. But if you're working at a back office function, or if you're working in marketing or legal, then we would be having a conversation around what do you need to have on your resume as a lawyer, or what do you need to have on your resume as a marketing professional, which is a completely different conversation. But that's just simply to say that whether someone is interested only in finance or whether someone has another background and they are not looking to change it, there are so many different types of roles that you can cater your career to, and still be able to technically work at a bank.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for mentioning that all of the other roles, not strictly finance related, that you can find in such a big corporation, and even like in smaller banks, you will always need people in HR, engineers, marketers. So I'm glad you mentioned it, because many times like people might find or might hear about like a sector and they might not think about all the other roles that are like in the backstage to make it happen and to make it like successful. So thank you for mentioning that. And I'm curious, so you mentioned some of the skills already that a person has to have to work in the industry. But I'm curious, your personal day-to-day in your current role, how is it like? What is the day-to-day look like for a person in a higher position right now, but in finance? And maybe if you can also add about how was your day-to-day in your first position related to finance after you graduated, I guess, from your master's.
Sure. So I'll start with the first position because right out of my MBA program, I joined the consumer bank, which is different from where I'm at right now. Right now, I'm in corporate and investment bank. And for anyone who isn't familiar, those are like two different universes. They're nothing alike each other. And at JPMorgan in general and at bigger banks, you would find different types of banking activities. For example, the consumer bank is very different from the commercial side of banking, and it is very different from asset and wealth management, and it's different from the investment bank. So out of school, I was hired into the consumer bank, and it was a rotational program. And I think that, this is a plug for people interested in banking. I think that rotational programs are one of the most amazing and excellent things you can do for yourself. Bigger companies typically have them, and it depends on the country that you're in. You might not have them in smaller banks, but I know, for example, JPMorgan has locations in the Middle East and London and Asia, and a lot of the other banks do have sort of like locations in other countries. But rotational programs are excellent in the sense that they provide different exposure to different parts of the bank. So the very first role that I had was in a function that sits within finance, so within the office of the CFO. And it was sort of like a very analytical function. It was called Finance and Data Insights. And it was essentially working with controllers, with the treasury function, working with the firm-wide data for financial controllers, and trying to help them in a lot of things related to analytics and research and automations and things like that. And so, prior to that, I had nothing on my resume, nothing on my career related to anything in finance. And then right out of school, I immediately jumped into one of the most complicated functions because it was a pure financial and sort of like a CFO function. So it took me a couple of months to adjust, but what I did back then was essentially what an associate would do, because I was hired as an associate, which is typically, think about it as like a project manager, or sometimes a product manager. And coupled with research, coupled with managing stakeholders, and coupled with creating processes and investigating and troubleshooting a lot of things. And then from there, I moved to corporate development. And in that role, I was essentially a financial analyst, meaning building models and building business cases for a lot of the investments that we are looking to invest money in. And then from there, I moved to market expansion, which is essentially sort of like a sister function to real estate, because we have banking presence nationally in the US and a lot of states. So I was essentially a project manager in that capacity. And then after that, that's when I moved to my current role, which is a VP at the Strategic Investments and Acquisitions Office, which, if you talk to anybody from JPMorgan, they almost always ask the inevitable question, like, how did you move there, and how did you sort of like pivot from consumer to this role? Because it is one thing to join a bank as an external candidate with no experience, and it's a completely different thing to join as someone with a banking experience, but it's a whole different universe. So it's similar in the sense that you kind of have to rewrite your resume all over again, because it's a completely different role. So today what I do is, my role essentially has excuse me, I'm still recovering from this terrible flu, but essentially there are two sides to my role today. One of them is a portfolio manager, and then the other is a business manager. And what that means is, on the portfolio management side, so my team essentially is a fund with more than 200 plus investments globally. So we invest in startups, we invest in different types of companies, we invest in different types of funds globally. And we have, the companies that we invest in are largely in the US, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And so, each territory has their own sort of rules and regulations and opportunities. So in my portfolio manager hat, when I'm wearing that, it's essentially being involved in the process of everything from A to Z, from researching what companies should we invest in, to those introductory conversations with the companies, negotiations and due diligence, and all the way to closing the deal. And then once the deal's on our books, essentially, then reporting on that on a monthly and a quarterly basis. In fact, today you're catching me at a cycle in our schedule where we have our quarterly valuations, because these are private investments, and every quarter we have to reassess the fair market value on our books. And then also we have to talk to the CEOs of the JPMorgan businesses, because ultimately, our investments are related to what we do as a bank. Even though we invest in, consumer banking companies, or even e-commerce startups, or a whole bunch of random things. At the end of the day, we have to talk to the CEOs and let them know how that investment is performing, and what's next for our strategy there. So it's sort of like a typical portfolio manager role. The other half of my job is a business manager, which essentially is managing processes and standards and procedures for how should we do our business. For example, we have certain investment policies that we have to follow. And when we do, for example, equity valuations, there are certain things that we have to make sure that we're doing, because we constantly get audited, and we have to make sure that we're compliant with those policies and procedures. And even in the sense that when we are looking for new investments and when we're engaging with the company and when we're doing the due diligence and all of these things, we have, for example, something that we call the investment checklist, meaning we have to like follow certain steps from A to Z when we're sort of like closing that deal. And even that, you know, I have to think about, what does your investment checklist look like and what do we need to cover? And how do we make sure that that investment checklist, for example, aligns to our standards and procedures? And then, you know, or for example, when we do background checks on the CEOs of these startups to make sure that, you know, they're not criminals, we have to have policies and standards that say, how do we perform our background check and what is acceptable for us to be compliant with the industry and with the regulators and also with our own standards at the bank. So I'm going to stop here. I know like that was probably a lot, but those are sort of like the two parts of what I do in my current role.
No, that was super detailed and it was really insightful. I even didn't have any idea what was like your day-to-day look like. And I see a bunch of questions coming up. If you have questions about any of this topics she has mentioned or any other topics, send them now. And it sounds like, going back to your explanation, it sounds like really you do have to implement a lot of like different skills, like communication, to communicate with the CEOs of like these companies or startup you're investing in. Also be like innovative enough to like be able to catch these companies again to invest in, like to do research about what companies are coming up, how can you invest in them, and then also like very detail oriented to do the audit part on the other side, or like be process focused to not miss any step, because you were saying like it might sound like a joke, but if you miss a step you might end up like in a problem of, oh, I didn't audit the person who's running the company properly. So so all of those details, it sounds like really amazing, because it sounds like if like many persons will have to do this job, and I know you have a team, but it's amazing how you have all these super different skills in one role. So it sounds really exciting. And some people are already asking questions about it. But thank you so much for that explanation. And I'm curious, right now in your role, like continuing with your current role, what motivates you, you personally in your current role in JPMorgan? And what advice could you give to aspiring finance professionals or someone aspiring to have a career in finance to reach similar heights in their careers? So especially for you, was there something specific that attracted you to change maybe from consumer to like this other side of banking? Or was it, maybe it can be like the name of the company, or maybe it was more like the role that you were able to do? What was it that it attracted you personally? And what is it that motivates you still to do the
So initially, the reason why I joined JPMorgan, and to summarize a long story short, I actually never really thought about it, because where I was as I was doing my MBA, my resume looked like somebody who would typically work at a tech company. And that's what I had in mind. I was applying to Amazon, and I was actually interviewing like with these companies, Amazon and T-Mobile and Google and Facebook, because that was my background back then. But I had spoken to a mentor of mine that I worked with in one of my prior companies, and he was the one who suggested that I apply to banking, and one of them being JPMorgan. And I kind of couldn't believe it at the time that someone with my background has a place in finance, but he was insisting that, you know, like that I try. And I was like, all right, if he thinks that I can do it, then I might as well just try. And it was really hard to rewrite my resume and sort of like change the direction of who I was as an individual and as a professional, from, you know, someone with a tech background to someone who's looking to do finance. But I think that one of the things that helped was coming out of an MBA program. And, you know, this is for anyone looking to do a sort of like a further degree. I think MBAs is one of those quintessential degrees that can change the direction of your career to any industry that you want, and especially in banking, because in banking they do have rotational programs, and then you'll have a lot of roles that hire straight out of college from MBA. So that was my motivation, essentially, is that my mentor told me to do so, and I did that. And this is, I think, it's a reminder that it's very important to have mentors in our careers that sometimes have insights and have advice that we wouldn't even think about. And so once I joined the firm and I worked in consumer banking, and then as I was working in consumer banking, you know, I have access to a lot of internal resources, and, you know, talking to more people and understanding more about what does the bank actually do and how does the bank make money, and what kinds of industries that we work with. And so I came across this role that I'm in right now, and it just seemed like the perfect role for me, because I came from startups before that. And so I thought, you know, wouldn't it be nice to go back to working with startups, but in a different capacity, as I'm still working at the bank. And as I learned more about it, it seemed like the perfect fit. So then I guess the advice for anybody interested in exploring roles in finance is, first of all, get yourself a mentor, not just one, but really you can talk to people that you've previously worked with, or people that are in your network, or, you know, just go network with other people and just ask questions and be curious. And you never know what someone might tell you that might literally change the course of your life. The other thing I would say is to just be curious, because I've seen it time and time again. Sometimes people get hung up on the traditional path of investment banking, the glamorous investment banker that, you know, works 80 or 100 hours a week and has sleepless nights and is sort of like hustling, and they think that this is the only way into banking. And while that is a very sort of important experience to have, it's not the only way that you could get into banking. The other thing is to be very, very specific about what you're looking for. And I say that from experience as I was interviewing for different roles, because, like we mentioned, there are different types of careers that you can have. Working at a bank is different from working at a PE fund or a VC fund, and is different from working at a company that is hiring payments professionals. And payments is one of those industries that is sort of still in demand and still hiring people from technical backgrounds too. And that is different, you know, from working in other financial services companies like insurance or fintech. And so when you're setting yourself out there and saying, oh, I want to work in finance, you need to be very specific about what is it that you're looking for, because, you know, in the minds of the recruiter and in the minds of the hiring manager, for me, if I'm hiring somebody, I want someone that fits the role that I'm hiring for. And so it is easier to hire people from traditional finance background, just because it makes sense, and you know, they're already from the cookie cutter
Right.
experience. But that doesn't mean that we don't hire from other backgrounds as well. But in order for that to happen, the burden falls on the candidate to explain themselves and explain their resume and what they're looking for in the terms that the manager understands, because, you know, the manager is only hiring for one specific role, but the candidate's sort of like usually casting a wide net, and that confuses the language when you communicate the kind of things that you're looking for. So those are some of the important things. Anything else is really figure outable, and you can just Google your way into anything you want. This is the beauty of the internet these days. There are so many things out there, and anybody can literally just watch it on YouTube or read it on a article on LinkedIn or something, and then you'll be fine.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this. And And I already share, we have in less than 2 hours a workshop about how to use AI to actually help you in your job applications, even in your CV, to even like explaining better ways that maybe we don't find right away, to explain ourselves what we want to communicate in our experience. So go and sign up or check it out, to actually use these tools to communicate these things that Safa was saying. Thank you so much for that. And I have two more questions for you, and then we will go ahead and take the questions that are coming up from the attendees. I'm mindful of the time. So I have a question about your journey, your personal journey from Iraq to moving to the US through a Fulbright scholarship. So did you face any like cultural shocks or any challenges that you might remember when you first transitioned from this country to another country? And then if you have like any tips for international students trying to land their first internships. I saw that there's like some people living in Canada, living in the US. So they might be in the stage of like trying to find their first internship or job after graduating college. So do you have like any tips in terms of like adjusting culturally, or anything that you remember you would like to know when you were in that stage?
I think that one of the important things is not to be hung up on the differences and to kind of always remind yourself that this is a new country, because it could be really overwhelming trying to navigate all of the new rules and all of the things that you have to do coming from a different country. Whether you're going to the US or Europe or anywhere else, it's so much easier when I remember working back in my home country, because I was already born into that environment. I already lived there for a few years. And so there are a lot of fundamental things that you kind of take for granted and you never really think about. And that allows you to just focus on learning what you have to learn in this new role. Whereas moving and working abroad in a new culture, you kind of have to go back to the basics and figure out, how does this culture function? Like, what is appropriate to say, especially in any large city where you have a mix of backgrounds. How do you talk to people from this country, from this culture, and how do you maintain that neutral, politically correct tone so that you don't say the wrong thing, coupled with the fact that you have to reestablish yourself with a bunch of documentations and a bunch of like, looking for apartments, getting a new car, and all of these things that come with being an adult at this point. And so those things sometimes overwhelm people so much when they don't know how to navigate them. And I see sometimes international students kind of like lock themselves into a corner just because they're afraid, or they think that it's too much to ask of themselves to kind of add more burden of figuring out how these things work. Like, for example, opening a bank account, or getting down to the bottom of all of these logistics. I feel like those are the things that I've seen students get lost in, because they're just only hyper focused on, I need to get a job, or I need to study, and I need to do these things. But you'll be surprised how important it is to be a well-rounded, full human being, because sometimes when you go into an interview, what's going to be in your favor is the things that you mention in terms of what your hobbies are. So what do you do outside of work? And especially coming in as a student, if you become the type of student that only focuses on studying and doesn't do anything else, that is actually going to negatively impact your career. Even if you have a 4.0 GPA, that's not enough, because what's going to differentiate you as a candidate at the end of the day is what else you're doing. And that includes things like participating in volunteering projects outside of school, or even participating in clubs at the school. For example, there is this investments club that I participated in where we essentially act as equity analysts and we analyze a whole bunch of different companies and their stocks. And surprisingly, that taught me a lot of things that I needed at my current job at the company. And, sometimes people connect with hiring managers over what sports team do you cheer for? What's your favorite sports team? Or what else do you do? And so those things are very, very important to highlight as a new candidate looking for any job. And I'm not saying that don't be a good student, like you still have to study, you still have to get a good GPA, but that's not everything. And so I think that's one of the important things to keep in mind as you're coming into a country like the US or any other country that is outside of your country of birth. The other thing, what was the second part of the question? Sorry, I think you said something about internships.
No, it was just about like your transition and if there was like any cultural shocks and oh yes, and then I mentioned if you had any tips for international students trying to find their first internship or job in the US or in any other country that might be not their country of origin.
Yeah, I guess so. To wrap up the part about the culture shock, there is really no culture shock these days with our access to social media and seeing what else is out there. I think maybe you might feel homesick. That is very sort of common. But again, as long as you don't keep thinking, oh, I'm going to have a culture shock or I'm going to experience those things, get that out of the way, focus on being actually curious about how this country functions, you're going to be fine. The other part about, tips relating to finding the first internship or the first job, again, it's being an interesting candidate and believing that you can actually get this role. And I know I'm not giving any technical or concrete steps because this is what I've seen. It's like 80% of it is a mental game. People get in their own way of thinking that, oh, I can't really get it. They're not going to accept me. And surprisingly, I've been told that even by career advisors on campus at my school. I talked to 3 of them and every single one of them said, you're an engineer. What are you doing in finance? You're not going to get that role. And so be careful about the advice that you get out there because, this is 2024. It's no longer, the 1980s or something where people are sort of very closed off to other candidates from non-typical backgrounds. As I say that, there are still roles here in banking that do hire the traditional way. But again, that's simply because it's easier and they're used to it. And in order to differentiate yourself as a candidate, if you have a non-typical background, then you simply have to believe it mentally and put in the work to boost your resume as a whole person, sort of like be interesting, be comfortable, and believe that you can get this role. And then once you're comfortable mentally, then all you need to do is just do a bunch of research. And there's a whole bunch of things out there on the internet that literally guides you step by step on how do you land a job in investment banking. And that's more than enough for anybody to put 2 and 2 together and then land the job that they want.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I did have another question, but I will leave it at the end because there's some questions coming up from the attendees, so I want to make sure we address those. But everything you have said is like really, it applies to any industry, basically, not even finance only, like any industry you want to work at. Those are like skills and like tips that apply to any student, basically. So thank you so much for that. So there's one question in the chat coming from Joy. So they're asking, how can one build problem solving and analytical skills? And you mentioned already some things about like joining clubs related to the topic, but is there any other way?
So one of the things that help is training yourself on building a business case. or doing a case study. And I know some universities offer that on campus, but you can also go online and find sort of organizations like the CFA Institute or Bloomberg or a lot of other places where you can essentially do equity research and analyze that company and how they're performing. You can do it in so many different ways, but that is one of the things that are going to really show you what it means to be analytical and to think about that. A lot of times there are questions out there of sort of like, what is the typical interview look like in an investment bank? And there are sort of like technical questions and non-technical. If you can read through those technical questions and either answer them for yourself or look for how someone else might have answered them, that is going to teach you a lot about how do you approach a problem analytically. Beyond that, I think you being analytical and being sort of like solving a problem, it really comes down to being curious and being thorough. But those are a couple of the things that you can do. So while you're at school, take advantage of all of the resources that are being offered. Outside of that, like again, analyze equity of like public companies, take a couple of extracurricular courses, do a couple of case studies, participate in a lot of webinars. I don't know how I come across these things, but there are so many times where I'm like reading an article and then it mentions a company and then I click on it and then that company has a webinar and then there's a career website on that company. And sometimes companies themselves, like for example JPMorgan, sometimes we do these webinars where we're teaching external candidates how to do these things. And so once you get the hang of like being curious about what the industry is doing, what the markets are doing, then you can find a lot of these resources and actually sit down and answer these questions and participate in those case studies. But then ultimately, honestly, you need to get yourself a couple of interviews because that is going to show you what the companies are actually looking for. And it's going to give you a taste of what they really mean when they say that they want someone with analytical skills.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of more questions on the Q&A. One is coming from Imad. So they have two questions. So one is for people who are interested in fintech and have a mixed background, saying they have both experience in tech and in finance. What are some of the opportunities that you know are available at big banks or corporate structures in this field?
That's a good question. I think that it really depends on what you are looking for. So if you have a mixed background between tech and finance, it depends on what do you mean by tech. Are you an engineer? Then there are a lot of engineering roles in banks. Or are you an analyst, or do you want to be an analyst? Then you can be an analyst in different parts of the bank. Again, like we mentioned before, there's consumer, commercial, asset wealth management, and then corporate and investment bank. And so I guess the typical route of the titles that you can get at a bank is essentially analyst, associate, and then you move to VP and ED and so on. Those are the roles that you're going to have, which absolutely means nothing unless you kind of like apply it to what does it mean to be an analyst at an asset and wealth management versus what does it mean to be an analyst at a consumer bank. So you can simply go to any company's website and then go through their career portal and then see the kind of jobs that are available out there. And it's going to look very different depending on the keywords that you use. For example, if you are interested in payments, which is one of the things that are very common among folks that have a tech and finance background, payment companies or tech companies can hire payment professionals, whether it's a bank or not. So I guess it really depends on what you're looking for, and you can kind of like cater your background around that, and then see what's available out there in each one of those companies, and then you know, reiterate your resume accordingly.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We have another question coming from Tony on the Q&A. So they're sharing that they're a fresh graduate with a bachelor's degree in economics, and they would like to work in investment banking or in banking in general. So they would like to know, what do you recommend to do as a fresh graduate? Because they're saying it's kind of difficult to find internships or entry-level jobs in that field for them in their country.
I'm curious which country is he from, but either way, investment banking, when I'm assuming that you mean the traditional investment banking route, which essentially you have to take certificates. There is sort of like, I think the Series 60 and like a whole bunch of like series exams that you have to finish. And sometimes there are some universities that offer training on campus on like how to study for these exams. But really you can go online and take any of these extra courses that prepare you to take these certificates. The good thing is that you don't have to take the exams before looking for a job, because a lot of times once you get hired, the company itself gives you sort of like a grace period to take the exam after you sign your contract, and then they pay for that exam for you. But just keep in mind that this is something that you will have to do as an underwriter in investment banking. So the question was, what do you recommend to do? This is one of the things to do. But other than that, get yourself in the mindset of researching what are the expectations in an interview, because then you can sort of like backtrack and solve from there. Like the goal is to land a job in investment banking. Okay, so what do? Is like go online, find a company that offers this role, read the job description, see the requirements that they have, and then from there walk backwards into bridging that gap between where you are right now and where do you need to go and to land that job. And in the process of doing that, just apply to the role. Obviously you're going to get rejected, and I feel like this is worth mentioning because banking is such a competitive industry. You're definitely going to be rejected 99% of the time, and so don't take it personally. It's not about you. Sometimes they don't even respond and give you any feedback in terms of like, why were you rejected? And so if you have that expectation, you're going to be fine in the sense that just keep applying to more roles. But I guess one of the things that would help you is, again, be prepared for those series exams, be prepared to answer a lot of technical questions, rewrite your resume in a language that the hiring manager and the recruiter understands, be prepared to communicate that resume in words that are close to the job description, and then make sure that your resume is ATS friendly, meaning you're not going to get auto rejected by the system just because you know, you formatted things the wrong way. And then apply on time or ahead of time, because hiring is very cyclical, and so you have to be aware of when these opportunities become available. Also make sure to reach out to people. You know, don't be afraid of sending a cold email to a recruiter. Reach out to LinkedIn. I can't tell you the number of people I have spammed in my life. Every single time that I apply for a job, many people don't respond, and I don't care. I just keep doing it. Ultimately, at least one person is going to respond, and that's all you need. You just need that one person. And then once you have that conversation, some people are kind enough to give you feedback and give you pointers to course correct. But in order to find that one person, you need a lot of dedication to volume. And with your volume of applying to a lot of roles, you need to be diligent about making sure that you don't forget about the basics of like formatting and like making sure that you have the keywords and having your certificates and studying and all of those things. So I hope I hope this covers this broad question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. It was pretty detailed. So thank you for that answer. And just following up, Tony shared they're from Lebanon.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And okay, so we have another question, the second part of the question coming from Imad. So they were asking specifically for Fulbright, if you know if banks and other big corporations are open to academic training and special academic training opportunities, especially in the fintech space. And for those of you, as myself, I was asking Imad clarification on this. For those of you who might not be familiar with Fulbright or with the US like rules, so academic training means the extra time you are allowed to work in the US after your Fulbright experience before going back to your country. So just for those of you who might be curious about this, and so yeah, going back, if you know, Safa, if there's any AT opportunities in the fintech space.
Sure. I think that this is company specific. Some companies are, some companies are not, but especially if you're looking for an internship, internships are usually anywhere between 1 month to 3 months. And sometimes it could be a little bit more than that. So that is something that you can definitely do. It just simply depends on the hiring situation of the bank. It is very common for big companies to work with international students. And in fact, this is a time of preferring to hire people from diverse backgrounds and people from, non-traditional backgrounds that are in the US. So you could definitely explore that option, but then don't be discouraged if you get rejected. It just means that maybe this is not the right time, or maybe that particular bank is not open to AT opportunities, but you can just sort of like keep looking for another company or another role, and then do something similar in a different space where the company is actually accepting of that. But yeah, this is something that is company specific. There is nothing that is industry wide against that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think we have time for one last question. So it's coming from Silva. So they basically, the question is, well, they're sharing that they're a math major. So they're just curious if you have any insights on what type of roles are there in finance for math majors, like what type of positions should they aspire or can they aspire to?
Yeah, math is one of those really nice degrees that you can have, and you can be a quant in the investment bank. So look for quantitative roles in investment banking. And if you can land a summer internship or a summer internship in a rotational bank, in a rotational program at the investment bank, then that would give you the opportunity to explore internally what kind of roles that are available. But when you say math major, immediately I'm thinking investment banking, markets, and especially sort of like quant related roles. It is very difficult to find people with math majors, but it's always important to hire those people. So I think that since you have that, it's incredible. I guess the only thing that you need is sort of like properly present your skills and properly communicate, and just be diligent about applying to those roles, and making sure that you get your foot in the door. And then once you get your foot in the door, then you're going to be fine looking for full-time roles after you do those internships.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for all of your questions. And thank you for staying late if it's late where you are. So thank you, Safa, again for your time. We know you're super busy, but we really appreciate your insights and your support. And we will have this recording available for everyone who wasn't available to watch it live. So if you have any questions while watching the recording, post them on the event page, and I'll make sure to direct you to the right resources. So you're receiving a lot of thank yous in the chat as well. And I don't know if you have any last words before we go.
No, I think that I appreciate everybody joining, especially during Ramadan if you're fasting where you are. And good luck with everything that you're working on. It is a very sort of exciting time. There are a lot of changes that are happening across different countries, and especially in the finance industry. Make sure that you keep up with what's going on in the news. Make sure that you are very curious about what's happening in the markets. Make sure that you are looking for bigger banks, because this is not a good time for smaller regional banks. They're being bought up and they're being sort of like going through some turmoil. But it is a good time because it's not a crazy market yet for candidates, meaning, a couple of years ago, we had a crazy market where, a lot of people like were hiring, and it was tough to stand out. But this is sort of like a good, calm time to be exploring and at least getting a couple of interviews in. You don't have to land something yet, but at least get yourself in the mindset and the habit of going to interviews and seeing what it's like. Even if you get rejected, that's fine. But once you do a couple of those, and making sure that you read a lot of what's out there, you're going to be more than fine. And so, yeah, best of luck. And I appreciate you having me here today. And if you have any more questions, don't shy away from shooting me a message. And I hope I'll be able to get to it.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. And we hope to see everyone else in another localized event. We have in an hour a workshop on how to use AI tools to improve your CV. So if you have time, you can go and check it out, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.